Dorothy, if we turn to the issue of a small number of leaders who turn out to be unhelpful in the longer term and really problematic in the immediate term, and by that I'm thinking of narcissistic leaders, what's your suggestion for people who are dealing with a leader who is obsessed with their own interests, who's driven by finding opportunities to advance their own career at the expense of what happens in the organisation, somebody who's usually picked up by very observant teachers, and we know teachers are great observers. What's some advice for teachers who are dealing with a person who doesn't seem to have a strong understanding of the moral purposes of schools and the roles that leaders can play in advancing those important issues about life chances of children and so on?
Big challenges for survival, really.
Yes.
It depends on what position you hold in the school, but people might make decisions, well, if I hop on the side of the principal, there are certain rewards that I will get, and that's the way they operate and how they maintain power. And a lot of people will make those decisions because they get promotion, they get various rewards.
Yes.
There are other people that decide that I'll just retreat to my classroom and keep at a low level, and they'll probably move on in a couple of years and I'll survive. And there are others that decide to leave, saying this is not where I want to be. And there are others that only have short-term conflict and will decide 1, 2 or 3. Join the club, hide or leave.
Yes. And that is a different boat than the good boat journey.
Oh, absolutely, yes.
So it seems, if we look at some of the literature about narcissistic leaders in workplaces, it looks at this point like there seems to be an increasing number of those people managing to convince employers that they are the person to lead the school or lead the organisation. So your strategies are really good for people who have a clear sense of the good things that schools and other organisations stand for. If you actually look at engaging with the narcissistic leader, how can you do that effectively when that person doesn't have your sense of empathy as a sound educator or a sound leader, doesn't have the moral buy-in in their own soul toward collective good? What do you suggest there?
Well, I think you always have to do the right thing. You have to make sure that that whatever you do, there's strong grounds for you doing it.
Yes, and that's good leadership in itself, doing the right thing.
Yes. And you need to have a support network in the school.
Yes.
Because that actually helps you survive as a human being.
Yes.
And it helps others survive too. And if possible, build some outside influential people that might moderate some of the behaviour, or at least enable you to do certain things. So building networks outside of the organisation, particularly with people which they are responsible with. And you may not have the capacity to do that, but if you do, it's a very good strategy.
That's an excellent strategy, because in a sense it's deprivatising the experience, which is potentially quite a toxic experience. And often results, from my experience, in if it's bad enough for long enough, or if the leader actually perhaps is more than a narcissist, perhaps a workplace psychopath, it can often mean the professionals within that organisation have to seek counselling services. Traumas are caused at home because of their distress and grief from the workplace. So leading up, in a sense, in a positive way
yes.
as a survival is very good. So what would you suggest? What might that look like?
Well, I can only relate to an experience that, my experience.
Yes.
And that is given a position where outside of that particular workplace you have significant influence with people, with other organisations, and using those people to continue to convey their support for you, the great work you're doing, that you're invaluable. So you use other people.
Terrific.
To do that. And sometimes you just have to do that.
Yes.
To survive, because it's very destructive to work in organisations like that.
Yes.
And it's very costly to the system, really, because you lose good people. People aren't able to contribute in a way that moves that organisation forward. And in today's world, they can destroy
yes.
organisations very, very quickly.
Yes, indeed. And you make an excellent point, because I think, again, the literature, the Snakes in Suits book, and other literature that I've read about narcissistic leaders and workplace psychopaths who are in formal leadership positions, it shows that they are really difficult people to experience, and that it's often very difficult for the good, morally focused people in the organisation to contend with that, because sometimes they don't have positional power, or indeed some of those leaders who are not intending to be very generative in their approaches to others often will actively undermine the people in the organisation whom they regard as unhelpful to their purposes.
And those people that join the club actually don't benefit by it. There's I'm sure a lot of people will be soul searching about how much longer you can compromise what you believe to remain in the club.
Yes.
And so they, as time goes on, they either leave or they wait
until the leader
goes, and will often be quite critical in various areas towards that particular person, but would never be seen to be not supporting them.
Yes, indeed.
So, so joining the club could be as destructive as not joining the club.
Yes, because in the end, all of us have souls.
That's right.
And each of us has a conscience that we have to reconcile our activities with, if we're reasonably self-aware. What about the situation that Andy Hargraves talks about in terms of toxic cultures, where you have a leader who may not be a workplace psychopath, but he or she is very pragmatic and is not geared to working towards advancing children's and students' interests, but in fact is using a workplace as a temporary doormat, in a sense. They're there for a short time. They know they're going to have to do particular things to get to their next stage. What about those leaders in terms of systems? Do you think systems need to become more cognizant of some of the features that we know from research about narcissistic leaders, and indeed just generally poor leaders who can't galvanise the commitment from staffs?
And I think it depends on the system. Some systems actually are responding because they get to continual complaints, union activity, that sort of thing.
Yes.
And often unions will step in and complain about a principal giving, and there's been evidence of that quite recently in Queensland, where a number of principals have had to face industrial action against some of their actions, which make it difficult for the system to manage, and usually they transfer those people to somewhere else and inflict them on another school and replace it with someone probably a bit more capable. But I don't think systems actually have a real understanding about that HR management. I think there could be a lot better practices.
Well, let's hope, and I know, I think it's Dr. Ehrlich recently has published something on narcissistic leaders and the enormous cost that they can create to an organisation. And let's hope some of that research continues in school settings, because I think the psychological literature has given us some insight into the difficult circumstances organisations face generally if they have those sorts of leaders within their midst. But I think there's more to learn, especially in school settings, about negative ways of leading. And one of the advantages of knowing more about them is, as you said, to get systems playing their part in making sure that they're responsive to situations that seem to be going awry.
I think the other area that we come across in terms of organisational culture is that a lot of principals will say, I can't do anything with these people, they won't do anything. As soon as I mention anything, they resist it, and they won't change. And just from my experience working with schools, many schools in Australia, I believe that we use the wrong language. I think we should be talking about building a new culture, a preferred future, rather than trying to change what is. And because culture is really built by people. If there were no people in the school, there'd be no school culture.
Yes.
So building a new culture, preferred future, so capturing hearts and minds, is I believe the more important than saying we need to change these people, because people only change themselves.
I like that. So that's moving away from an external body or a formal leader working on people to change them, and a more collective approach where people look inside themselves and see what they can contribute in good faith to make a better workplace, and especially for children.
And they decide what the preferred future is, based on data, based on needs of students, and setting some goals for themselves that they move towards. And I think it's how you build a new culture. And one of the things that we've used quite successfully is what we call a history walk.
Oh.
Because people often say, you need to get rid of the old culture.
Yes.
And what I say, no, you need to acknowledge the old culture, but you need to demonstrate how it has morphed and changed over a period of time. And then you can set some goals for the future. And because some people have spent their whole lives in schools, they've had schools where they've gone to that school, they've come back, and it's the only school they've ever taught in. So 25 years, 30 years or more, they have contributed to that school. So to say to them what you've done in the past needs to be buried is, it's disrespectful.
Very.
So you say, okay, let's hear what it was like back in those days. And just going through, lining stuff up as in a line that was the oldest to the most recent arrivals, and hearing their stories. And it's a wonderful experience, and people come out of that with a new way of looking at the future.
I like that. I especially like it because it acknowledges that people 20, 50 years ago were still seeking meaningful work, right? The shape of what constitutes meaningfulness at work may have changed, but that fundamental quest that human beings have, well, certainly educators and people in jobs that are not soulless jobs, is really important for leaders to comprehend.
And I think your word meaningful work and meaningful workplaces is something that in the 21st century we need to explore.
Yes.
And certainly the business world is, and you can Google and find lots of things about meaningful work and meaningful workplaces in the business literature. But we don't seem to talk about that in schools, and yet we have what I call the Y-gen teachers who come with, I'm sure their brain is wired differently to mine, and come with a big need to demonstrate that they know lots, they should be listened to, they want to contribute,
yes,
they're excited about what they might do,
yeah,
and the profession doesn't embrace that.
Mm-hmm. So there are some generational tensions.
Oh, I believe so. Very, and it's starting to appear in the literature as well. There was ASCD in their Educational Leaders had a whole section on Y-Gen teachers.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, and why I think it's important is they're our future. So if we're not retaining people in schools, our new teachers in schools, and Y-Gens won't hang around. If they're not recognised, acknowledged and embraced, they'll go somewhere else that will recognise their talents and give them the rewards that they expect.
Yes.
And these aren't money rewards. They're not actually after money, they're after recognition.
Yes.
And approval.
Yes.
And I think that we just need to, we meaning the age group that dominate the
baby boomers and so on, yes.
Need to think carefully about what is a meaningful workplace in today's world, and how do we build that? How do we embrace young people to acknowledge where they're at, but also that they have a lot to learn, but in a way that and they enable them to do that themselves.
Terrific. When we turn to the issue of organisational trust, and in particular leaders needing to put their hand out first, they should be trusting before they expect others will trust them. How can leaders do that well when some members of staff are more open to trusting, they're just more trusting individuals than others who are more reluctant to trust and take people on faith and have to be convinced over time that somebody else is trustworthy?
You have to have some processes.
Yes.
And I'll just talk about one process that we've used. When we first started to work with schools, we were absolutely amazed, and probably this was our experience, but we've forgotten, even after only a couple of years out of schools, is that staff meetings were such hostile environments, and that people actually liked to spill blood on a regular basis. And we're thinking, well, if we try to get people to have a shared understanding about the future that provided hope and was motivating and so on, we had to have ways of which people could better communicate with each other.
Oh, good.
So we actually came across, just purely by accident, the area of professional conversation and dialogue that Senji talks about. Because he actually gives this wonderful description of when he was brought into a industrial situation to solve, and he said every time they came together there was blood all over the table. We had to have a better way of listening to each other.
Yes.
And he used Isaac's work on dialogue, but he called it skillful discussion.
Okay.
So we've actually developed that quite extensively and train people how to have a professional conversation.
Excellent.
And that includes principals and executives, people sitting with teachers, having a conversation about issues that are usually quite passionate about things, and coming to some resolution, not vote, because people often vote, well, you either win or lose. So you've got to try to develop a process where it's a knowledge creation process, actually. So we've actually used our understanding of knowledge creation through collective intelligence and used the process of skillful discussion and dialogue to enable people to do that. Now, once people actually understand the process, they value it. Then they start replacing that. They often call it protocols of conversation. They'll replace that for staff meetings and things like that. So you actually build a whole capacity of people to listen to each other and to follow some rules.
Yes.
Because these are professional workplaces. They're not social clubs. They're not, the local footy match where you can punch somebody and disappear and be friendly the next day. They are professional workplaces.
Yes.
And should be treated as such.
Yes.
So that has, when we've come back and completed some research, that's one of the things they tell us very early in the piece. Doing that, we felt safe.
Excellent.
It's not non-judgmental, because there's these rules, withhold judgment, don't be disparaging, don't ping pong,
Yes.
listen to each other, stop thinking about what you're going to say instead of listening to the other person.
Yes.
So they're sort of just rules of active listening, really, but effective listening. But it is about saying, well, if we think together this way, we can create something which we're all part of, but it's not our idea. It's a collective idea.
I like that.
And it's very powerful.
Yes.
And it has, this is one of the things that we believe has enabled people to build a trusting relationship with each other, because they can critique each other's practice and
Yes.
not be judgmental about it.
Yes.
Because you want to get to a stage where, if teachers are the key for organisational transformation,
Yes.
then you have to be able to critique practice.
Yes. And remember, behind the practice is a person.
That's right.
And so being a critical friend
That's right.
is the way forward. Okay,
So,
what about...
So it does enable people to take risks,
Yes.
and because you're operating in a no-blame environment.
Yes.
And principals love no-blame environments because they just say, this is so good, because it's about collective decision-making.
Yes.
That, if we've all made this decision together
Mm-hmm.
and we have processes that enable all voices to be heard, then, we live by those decisions.
Yes,
and,
indeed.
And I can raise questions that, as a principal, I need to ask about why aren't our student results as good as what we hope, instead of people then going to ground and complaining. So we can have a conversation about what it is I need to do to help, what we need to do together to help to get better outcomes for our students.
That's terrific. Let's turn to high poverty schools. Now, in Australia, there are thousands of high poverty schools,
Absolutely.
just as there are in Canada. And in Canada, like Australia, many systems are trying to improve the experiences of students in those schools, but they're seen to be amongst the most difficult organisations to support and improve. Now, in Australia, as with here, there are attempts by school systems and boards to better fund high poverty schools because of social capital being different in populations where lots of people live in poverty. We know from demographic detail that the life chances of a lot of kids now who are living in material or other forms of poverty is lower than children who come from middle class or upper class homes. So because most leaders in schools are aware of the importance of social justice and equity, they are trying to improve the experiences in their schools for students. But systems have still got a long way to go. What do you think systems could do now in the next decade that would heighten the opportunities of the students who go through those schools?
Well, it's not giving them more money.
Right.
And I'm not saying they shouldn't be better funded, but just giving them money will not make any difference.
Yes.
And there's been a major report just done in Australia on our Indigenous schools. It's called Closing the Gap. Was the funding program, and schools then were supposed to take on initiatives and close the gap.
Yep.
And unfortunately, it's been a very sad, because the gap hasn't been closed in 98% of the schools.
Yes. So
this was an issue that we looked at in our last bit of research that we did, because we worked with inner Western Sydney schools. And these are schools that they have between 60 to 90+% early new immigrants.
Yes.
So they're non-English speaking, often refugees, coming out of camps or whatever, off boats. And these schools, and they were Catholic schools, had a strong sense of moral purpose we need to make the lives of these students better.
Yeah.
And one of the things that the system did was to say, we need to care and make them feel safe, but that's not good enough.
Yes.
We need to make sure these students can achieve. So high expectations is an absolutely essential part of our vision for our system. So, and that was transparent. I mean, they made it very clear what their vision was. I went to a whole process of getting people together, and they published documents and all those sorts of things. And it was continually conveyed by the system to the school. But there was never fingers pointed like, you haven't done the right thing. It's about, how can we help you make a difference? And one of the things that the system has done is used a process, which is the process that we have for school improvement, saying, well, you can it's up to the schools. There are different things you can do, but here's a process you might want to use. And so the schools that we studied, ones that had used the IDEAS process, which is a whole school improvement process. And when we said, are these schools in inner Western Sydney that are surrounded by 6-foot fences with press the button to get in and whatever, can these schools make a difference in student achievement? And of course, when you do that research, you've got to use measures that any policymaker will give any credibility. So in Australia, we have national testing. It's called NAPLAN. So we used NAPLAN results, and that was a challenge in itself, because trying to compare schools and how you measure value-addedness is an issue. But fortunately, after a year and a half, we actually had solved that problem. We think we did, and looked at tracking individuals. And we picked schools that had, over a 3-year period, improved the learning outcomes of students above the national average.
Okay.
And then we went in and looked at what those teachers did.
Oh, excellent. So tell us about what those teachers did.
So what the school did.
Okay.
And the system did.
Okay.
So it's really picking up Fullen's work and really confirming what he had found earlier, is that schools aren't islands, they're part of a system. And if there is to be long and term sustainable change, the whole thing needs to work together. And so the expectations of the system need to be supported by the people that work between systems and schools, which in this case were called regional directors and regional principal advisors, and that they kept saying, how can we help you? How can we?
Okay, so there was coherence
and that sort of thing. So there was coherence, absolute coherence.
Right. Okay, let me turn to an instance where I can think in my last school, as a principal of a high poverty school, that I had to go each month, and you'd be familiar with this, to meetings with the superintendent and the local district personnel. And I recall a situation, actually, I'd just come back from the National College of School Leaders, and another principal and I had to do a presentation on what we'd found there. But in the course of that presentation, and both of us were from high poverty schools, one of the senior people, not the superintendent, but a senior person, got up and talked of our students as feral. And of course, I countered that. That doesn't matter for what we're discussing today, but the point was, that signalled to me that there was incoherence structurally between a district position or a regional board and what was happening in the high poverty schools, and to position children as like a wild creature was not only adopting a deficit view of children who happen to live in poverty, but it was also signalling that those children were worth less than most mainstream children. So what do you think about that?
I think that just keeps people in positions where they are. That's
yes.
what it's about. I mean, it doesn't matter who you are, if you have and this is in literature, high expectations, just because they're in poverty, just because their life chances don't look great, it doesn't mean that they can't achieve.
Absolutely.
And people who believe that schools are schools of hope, Terry Wrigley's work.
Yes, Michael Fullan's work.
Bill
Mulford's
that's
work.
That's right.
Yeah.
And there's evidence out there that it is the attitude that people develop that make the difference in children's lives. And you can, going right back to Fred Newman's work in 95, where he said if people find ways to work together, if teachers and principals, and share a common understanding, the coherence across the school, support each other, and have a very clear view about how you work in these schools, he called it authentic pedagogy, you can
do amazing
close the
things.
gap.
Yes.
But he said you can't close the gap entirely, but you can improve their life chances.
Absolutely.
And that research has been repeated in Australia 3 times.
Yes.
Same results, and evidence is there. But the big issue is about how the system. This takes time. You can't do it overnight. And how then the system responds to that, because they often the things that sustain progress, systems will move principles, or there'll be a lot of disruption, and so that actually interferes with what's often happening at the school level.
Yes, indeed.
And but I think there is a big issue in Australia, and this is something that concerns Australian educators, is that our Indigenous people, as much as we've tried many things, we're still not even a third of the way there.
Yes, indeed.
Particularly those that live outside of urban areas, that live on reserves, or they live in outlying areas. We struggle.
Yes.
And struggle because of all the other social factors that are impacting on them, and disharmony over land rights and lots of things, issues that I think probably Canada has similar.
It does.
Issues.
And regrettably, like Australia, if you want to know where the highest poverty is, just look for large numbers of First Nations or other Indigenous Canadians. And in Australia, where the most challenging schools are is where, of course, Australian Aboriginal students can be found. So looking at the organisations that respond respectfully to all children and take up the challenges inherent in leading high poverty schools, how do you see school systems can improve their contribution to the work of people in those schools regarding appointing more experienced teachers to those schools? Because we know from multiple examples of research that typically it is the least experienced teachers who end up in large numbers in those schools, which then harks back to the issue of critical mass, the limited capacity for mentoring and coaching, the inability of wonderfully motivated, keen, dedicated novice teachers to grasp the opportunities before them in very challenging classrooms. What do you say about that?
Well, that's the reality of those schools, and we've got to do things differently. We've got to look for solutions that we're not putting the least experienced people in the most complex and difficult schools and expecting to have
the same advances.
And then when you've got people that actually are making a difference in the short term, you decide to transfer them somewhere else. And I think we've got to rethink schools and schooling. A lot of people are talking about even if you had experienced people there, some of the social problems that are in those communities are such that unless the school becomes the community,
yes,
that you're not going to be able to resolve those. So you need everybody to be working together,
yes,
and having a shared understanding about what we're trying to do, and engage, not doing things to people, but doing things with people.
And for people.
And for people,
yes.
Yeah.
So if we look at high poverty schools and the complex circumstances that they face, we often see intergenerational poverty. And with that come adults who have low trust in institutions, including with schools, who themselves may have left school early and or had very bleak experiences as students. We see major challenges that systems can assist schools to work toward removing. But that's going to take long periods of time, as you suggest. What are some important factors for principals and other leaders in those sorts of schools so that they can remain resilient and optimistic in the face of very difficult circumstances?
Well, one of the things that principals need to do is be more visible within the community. They have to bring the community into the school.
Why?
Because you have to build trust with the community. And so the principal's job is not being with teachers in classrooms, but it's being out in the community, opening up conversations, and putting in systems that enable parents to negotiate an institution which they feel very uncomfortable in doing.
Excellent.
So putting in place processes where you actually have meetings in community halls, or you invite parents in to be engaged in learning English, or to learn how to cook Australian meals, or community gardens. I think just thinking some of those areas in the Broadmeadow area in Melbourne, where they're just, the school and the community is, the boundaries are blurred.
Yes.
And they're having great success.
Yes, indeed.
Retaining students in schooling, parents feeling quite comfortable now to come into the school and do things that they need to for their own education, really. And a lot of those schools are actually having great success in negotiating pathways for students into work and into tertiary and vocational education.
Learning or earning.
So the teachers' roles in those schools are a lot different than what you would find in some of the other schools. And they have to be, because they have to be advocates for students.
Yes.
Because the students haven't got advocates.
And they have to respond to the context in which they work.
That's right, yes.